How does the keto diet work? As the keto diet is getting more popular, it's having more people have great results. It's popping up in media in various places, but the most common reaction is people looking confused. They shrug their shoulders and they say, this seems really weird. It seems to help people, but we better hold off. So today we're going to talk about how it actually works so that you understand why and you can do it the right way. Coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympian in decathlon. And if you like to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure that you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. So in a nutshell, the keto diet or the ketogenic diet is when you get your body into ketosis. How do you do that? You reduce carbohydrate so that your body starts burning fat, and a byproduct of burning fat are ketones, which is a great supplemental fuel for your brain. So when carbs are scarce, your brain can run up to 75% ketones. And that's how the body has adapted to survive in times of starvation. And when the body gets better at burning fat, then obviously you burn some fat off the body and you lose weight. That's why it works. But let's talk about some of the more intricate mechanisms that people are confused about. So the body has three sources of fuel, three primary sources. It can also burn alcohol and glycerol and ketones, but the primary fuel are carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Carbohydrates, they are sort of quick. They absorb quickly, they burn quickly, and they go away quickly. We have a very limited ability to store carbohydrate. Fat is our long-term fuel. It is like you put a log on the fire and it burns and keeps you warm for a very, very long time. And protein is for muscles. Muscles perform work. They're necessary for our survival in terms of moving around and producing work. So we don't want to touch the protein unless we have to. We don't want to burn the protein in the muscles, but if we have excess protein in the diet, we can also use that for energy. So the body can store fuel in different forms. It can store a tiny little bit of carbohydrates as glycogen, about a day's worth. It can store almost unlimited amounts of fat, and it can store protein in the form of muscles. But like we said, you don't want to touch that unless all other options are exhausted. Fat is the body's preferred and most efficient storage form of fuel. So excess carbohydrates are going to trigger a strong insulin response, and insulin is going to take the carbohydrates out of the bloodstream and into the cell, and whatever we can't use in this moment, which isn't very much, is going to be stored as fat. Fat is also going to be stored as fat, and protein, if excess, is also going to be stored as fat. So everything that is truly excess gets stored as fat. But the tendency to store these depends on how much insulin they trigger. The more insulin we have, the more the tendency is to put the fuel into the cell. And since carbohydrates trigger the most insulin, then they have the highest tendency to store fat, to store excess fuel. And fat has the lowest tendency to store fat. So what that means is when we eat fat, we use it and we get full for a long time, and we don't tend to store very much because there's still some body fat that we can use for fuel. Protein has a low to medium tendency to be stored. The excess can be stored. If we eat a lot of it, then we say it's a medium tendency to store it because protein in excess also triggers insulin. Low to moderate amounts of protein does not trigger any insulin. So that's the basics that we need to understand about how the body uses fuel for energy, how it stores it, and how insulin plays into that. Now, this system is set up for survival. And humans have been around for a long time, and other animals on the planet have been around even longer. And for all of that existence, there have been periods of feast and famine. We've had periods where there was more food, and we've had periods where there was less food. And the body is set up to store the excess so that when we have a famine, when we have less food, we can use the excess. We can retrieve the stored foods and survive when there is none available. We have this cycle, this ever ongoing cycle of regular variation where we store, we use, we store, we use. Feast, famine, feast, famine. And as far as I know, there is no animal on the planet that has ever had an exception to that. That they've had periods where they could eat a little more, and they've had periods where they had to burn some of the fuel off the body, where they get a little skinnier. And this has never ever changed, to my knowledge, until modern times. Primarily after the Industrial Revolution, after 1850, but especially after World War II, when pretty much every country today don't have much famine. So we have a totally new situation. We've had something now today that we've never had before. And the body is perfectly set up for surviving feast and famine. It knows how to deal with not having a whole lot of food and then having periods with more food. It knows how to deal with that change, but it has no idea how to deal with a constant feast. It's never encountered that. It doesn't know how. And then what makes it worse is that we've changed the type of food. Not only is food fairly abundant, but it has gone from whole food from a hunter-gatherer, scavenger, feed off the earth, to agricultural and processed foods, where we've gone from low carb to high carb, from somewhere maybe around 10 to 20% carbs, all the way up to 50, 60, 70% carbs. And the majority of those carbs are processed, they're refined. They have even stronger influences on insulin, and they have less nutrition. So we've changed the rules. And because of this, and because we never have a famine, because we eat more carbohydrates, because we eat more processed foods, the amount of insulin responses are astronomical compared to what we've had in the past. And not only are they high, but they never let down because it's always a feast. So what happens now is when insulin is always abundant, we get insulin resistance. And how common is that? Well, the official numbers are that somewhere around a third of the population or so is insulin resistant. But those are only the documented cases, the pretty advanced cases. If you understand insulin and you understand that being overweight is almost 100% synonymous with having insulin resistance, then you understand that according to the CDC, 87% of the population is overweight. That means 87% of us at least have some degree of insulin resistance. That's how prevalent this is. So then we take that and now we add sugar and grain, and we add the fact that we're eating first 3, and then we've increased that to 4, 5, 6 meals a day because we're encouraged to eat small meals and frequent snacks to top off the blood sugar. So now what also happens is we become carbohydrate dependent. We keep putting in that fuel so often for so long that it becomes, the body has to get rid of that because high blood sugar is dangerous. And because we're putting in so often, the body has to get rid of it, the body becomes dependent, and it doesn't know really how to use any other fuel in a proper way. So now when we top off our carbohydrates every 2 hours, we are told to give our kids cereal for breakfast and a mid-morning snack and a high-carb lunch and a mid-afternoon snack and an after-school snack and then a dinner and then an evening snack. Now, this is what happens to the blood sugar. we get a blood sugar roller coaster. We are topping it off every couple of hours. And with all of that carbohydrate and that frequent feeding, then there is no incentive for the body to burn fat. Why would it? We have to always ask ourselves, why is the body doing this? Is the body stupid or is it intelligent? Is it doing what it needs to? Absolutely. So it has no incentive to burn fat because there's all these carbohydrates, all these starches, all these grains, all the sugar, all the cookies and waffles and crackers coming in every couple of hours. And that, of course, fuels the insulin resistance, so we become more and more insulin resistant. And what happens then with insulin resistance is that the trend, the tendency for the body is to be in a storage mode. Because there's always carbs coming in, we got to get rid of the carbs. We got to put those carbs out of the bloodstream because they're dangerous in the bloodstream and into the cell. The cell gets enough, the cell doesn't want it, it increases, become more and more insulin resistance. But what this means is that everything we put into the cell, because it's a one-way trip, we can't retrieve it. So not only are we carb dependent, but we don't even know how to access the fat if we wanted to, because it's like a revolving door that only goes one way. So that's the problem. This is what we have done. That's how we have changed the rules. Nature has set up rules and we changed them. 3 ways we changed them. First, there used to be famine, now there's no famine. We used to eat pretty low carbohydrate. Now carbohydrate is the dominant fuel source for us. And we used to have a mix of fuels to use, and now we are carbohydrate dependent. We don't know how to properly use those other fuels. So we've changed the rules. And keto is, the reason keto is so popular and so effective is that it is the solution for an insulin-resistant world. When almost everyone is insulin resistant, then we have to have a tool to undo that insulin resistance. And the more insulin resistant you are, the stronger and more powerful the tool has to be. For some people, it's enough just to reduce the carbohydrates, but for a lot of people that's not enough. They have to reduce the carbohydrates dramatically. They have to get the carbs way, way, way low before the body realizes it has no other source of fuel. It has to start burning fat. And it will eventually, if forced strongly enough. So keto is the solution for an insulin-resistant world. When we reduce carbohydrates, eventually the body will find other sources of fuel. And what are those sources? Well, fat, obviously. When 87% of us are overweight, that means we have hundreds of thousands of calories per person stored on our bodies in the form of fat, but we can't get to them with excess insulin and with a constant flow of carbohydrates. So when we reduce the insulin, now we get access to those stores. We teach the body to become fat burning, and as a result, we also produce ketones. Whenever we burn fat, we produce ketones. The more fat we burn, the more fat adapted we become, the more dominant fat becomes as a fuel source, the higher our ketones go. And we can verify those ketones. So for a lot of people, you don't have to get very fancy. If your hunger goes down and you lose weight and you can go longer between meals without being hungry, then you don't probably have to measure ketones. But if you think you're doing the right things and you're struggling a little bit or maybe plateauing, then you need to measure ketones to verify that what you think is going on is actually going on. So doing keto, getting in ketosis, means that typically you're going to eat somewhere around 75% of your calories from fat, 20% or so from protein, and about 5% from carbohydrates. That means you need to cut out sugar and grain and all starchy food, because if you eat any of those, then you will send that number higher than 5%. It needs to be as low as 5% in order for the body to be forced to start looking for that other fuel that it's forgotten how to use. 20% protein is meat, fish, chicken, nuts, etc. 75% fat comes from avocado, nuts, and fats and oils. So it's not about eating more fat, it's about eating less carbs. And then you just want to increase your fats so that you get full. You don't try to eat more fat if you're full. You need to get satisfied, otherwise you're confusing your body and you're putting it in a state of deprivation, which is not sustainable. So there are 10 steps, and we'll go through those so you understand these really crystal clear. So step 1 is to change your fuel supply. That means reduce your carbohydrates. And you want to do that gradually so your body has a chance to get adapted. A lot of people try to go cold turkey from 60% high processed grains and sugar straight down to 5%, and their body's going to have a shock and they feel terrible. For some people, they prefer to do it that way. They rather suffer a few days and be done with it. Others, you can do it slower and not have to go through that suffering. Number 2, as you do that, your body becomes fat adapted. It learns how to use fat again as another source of fuel. As you start using more fat, then whether it's from the body or in the diet, you lessen your carb dependence. That means you get less cravings. And now, because you eat less carbs, you trigger less insulin, you're allowing the body a chance to reduce the insulin resistance. Number 5, as insulin resistance goes down, now you get access to the body fat. And this is the key. This is the magic, that you get fat adapted, you lose insulin resistance, and when you have access to your body fat, now your body has an virtually unlimited fuel supply. The reason that you've been eating so much is that your body doesn't know where the energy is. You confused it with all that sugar and insulin, and it stashed away all the fat for future use, but it couldn't get to it. Now that you're starting to reduce insulin resistance, all of that energy becomes available, and you have an unlimited source of fuel, which means that you don't get as hungry. Why would you have to eat if you have unlimited fuel on your body? The body doesn't care if you get the fuel from what you eat or from the body. And that's the beauty of getting fat adapted. That's what most people miss when they're shrugging their shoulders and they're saying, well, we don't understand how this works, and maybe it's about calories. Yes, it's about calories, but you have all those calories on your body. You just don't know how to retrieve them until you become fat adapted. As you have less hunger, you will eat fewer calories. And this is obviously key, but you can't start there. This is where all yo-yo diet programs fail, because they try to reduce calories without becoming fat adapted and without reducing insulin resistance. If you reduce calories without addressing those, now you get hungry, you feel deprived, and you lower your metabolic rate, you feel terrible, and you can't sustain it. But when you have access to body fat, now you eat less because it feels like the natural thing to do. Obviously now weight loss follows, if not immediately, it will eventually. What happens now also is you start reversing syndrome X. You start reversing metabolic syndrome. So the high blood pressure and the high cholesterol and the cardiovascular disease and a lot of the cholesterol values, PCOS and man boobs, and a lot of these different things are starting to reverse without you really trying, because you're addressing the root cause, which is insulin and processed excessive carbs. And number 10 is the key. There is no deprivation. This is why this works, and this is why it's sustainable. Unlike any other deprivation diet, you cannot deprive yourself for the rest of your life. You cannot deprive yourself for a period of time and expect not to go back after doing it for a period of time. The keto diet addresses the root cause, so it's sustainable because you find a natural pattern of eating. At this point, most people find that 3 meals a day is too much because you have all the food on your body. You can take a meal off your body. You don't have to eat all 3 meals. And as you do this, you start finding a balance, and you start finding that 1 to 2 meals is plenty for most people. Once you've lost all the weight, then you can start eating twice a day. It doesn't really matter, but this allows you to find the balance that's right for you. Quickly getting back to these numbers, the 75% fat, 20% protein, 5% carb. This is not something that you have to sustain. You have to sustain the low carb in order to reduce insulin resistance. But as you start burning more fat off your body, you don't have to eat so much fat because you already have the fat on your body. On a 2,000 calorie diet, 75% is 1,500 calories. That's about 165 grams of fat. You probably want to try to eat that in the beginning while your body gets fat adapted. But once it is fat adapted and your hunger reduces, then you keep the carbs low, but you just eat as much fat as you need to get full. So can you do the keto diet for the rest of your life? I think you can. I think it would be safe. Do most people have to? I don't think so. I think for a lot of people with a strong genetic predisposition toward insulin resistance and a very strong predisposition to gaining weight, then keto might be the best lifestyle. Keto and intermittent fasting might be the best lifestyle for them to sustain. But a lot of people who aren't so far over on the insulin resistance spectrum, they might find a balance that is outside of ketosis. They might get into ketosis once in a while or a lot of the time, but I don't think they need to be there all the time. They can develop a balance somewhere in the low carb area, maybe 50, 70, 80 grams of carbohydrate a day. Personally, I don't need to be in ketosis, but I am in ketosis most of the time because that's just the way I eat. But also I don't worry about it if I feel like I want to have some potato, but that's based on my personal genetics. That's my personal body type. It starts with learning and understanding the mechanisms, and then you try out what works for you and you find the balance that provides the best function and the best health in your case. If you enjoyed this video, I'm pretty sure you're going to love this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.